There was one about 1958, a black and white one that they talked about the Titanic. Oh, good. Yeah. That was really nice.
I bet it was.
And of course, a lot of Titanic survivors were still alive at that time. I'm sure they yeah, that's one thing. Interest in this topic we never diminished. There's a whole new generation of kids coming on. Ready?
Okay. Thank you all for coming today. It's such a beautiful day outside, and I hope you guys are doing well. And we had a lot of interest in this one, so I thought there'd be a big group. But so my name's Chris. I'm the public service librarian here at the library. And before we get started, we have some flyers of upcoming programs that are going to be happening pretty soon. We've got one more adult program this month, which is going to be on the 22nd. We're going to have an author come in and talk about genealogy. And then after that, we're getting into the summer reading program. So we have a whole bunch of stuff lined up for the summer. Check our calendar and watch for our flyers. So let me go ahead and introduce Darcy here. The Winterset Public Library is pleased to introduce Darcy Maltby. This program has been funded by Humanities Iowa, a private nonprofit, and the State Historical Society, Inc., a cultural resource for Iowans since 1971. Humanities Iowa brings humanities programs into the heart of Iowa communities. The humanities are fields of study that help us to discover and remember who we are and how we came to be as individuals and as part of the world. Humanities Iowa offers funding for the Speakers Bureau event and for grants in support of public programs to nonprofit organizations in the state of Iowa. If you have not already, please sign the sign-in form following the event. We have a couple forms over here. One's for Humanities Iowa and one is for our events. You're not required to sign them, but if you'd like to know about upcoming events, go ahead and sign them. And I am signed up for Humanities Iowa. I rarely get an email from them, so they're not gonna, send tons of emails. Yeah, and the same with us. I try to send out one a month. This month I'm going to send out 2, but that's the first time I've ever done that. So we don't send you a ton of emails either. And where was I? Okay. On that same form, you can opt in to receive monthly emails about Humanities Iowa events all over the state, as well as its annual print magazine. I would encourage you to sign up for both communications. They are great ways to stay informed about humanities events like this one all across Iowa. Humanities Iowa assures me that they respect your privacy and will not sell or share any contact information you may choose to provide. And with that, if we could all please welcome Darcy Maltby.
Iowans are so nice. They clap before the speaker even says anything. You're amazing. And I would just add, maybe if you were even so kind as to pass around that Humanities Iowa sign-up sheet. I only make that plea because of all the budget cuts that are going on right now. Some of this is in peril. And so if you like these kind of programs, your voice needs to be heard. And just signing up and saying, hey, we had 25 people here tonight says a lot. So thank you for being here. It is a wonderful, beautiful, perfect Iowa spring day. And I will hopefully make this worth your while to be trading your time for these amazing Titanic stories. Would it be helpful to you if maybe we killed some of the lights?
Yes.
Do you think that would be better? Yes. Okay.
Oop, the other way.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
And I also tell people I'm not a teacher. This is not school. So if you have questions or comments as we go, it's perfectly fine with me if you just raise your hand or shout out, and we'll cover all that as we go. So the Titanic. For me, actually I've been into this since I was a kid, but what really sparked the idea that I should probably write a book about this, and the book is still a work in progress, but I promise it's going to get done. It started in a big way when I went to a tea party in Iowa City in 2017. It was a lady named Lily Setterdahl. She is an author, and she had written a book about Not My Time to Die, which was about Swedes on the Titanic. Lily is Swedish. It's speak Swedish, and that's a blessing because she could translate a lot of letters that were written in Swedish from Titanic survivors that had never been translated before. And lo and behold, one of those letters was from a lady named Dagmar Breil. You will meet her in this program. She was headed to Iowa, and I had never heard her story before. I knew there was at least one other family that had ties to Titanic in Iowa, and I was so intrigued, I wrote a blog post about this, and that really caught fire and inspired me to keep researching. You see the boarding pass up there in the top middle section there. Anybody ever done one of those Titanic museum or events where you have a boarding pass? Yes? And you assume the identity of a real passenger? Well, remember the name Frances Marie Lefebvre, because that was my boarding pass in Iowa City, and we'll find out today whether I lived or died. Oh, and I might add Dagmar, since I mentioned her. She's right there in the middle on the bottom row. That's Dagmar Breil. So I mentioned I was into this since I was a child. So how many of you remember 1985 when Dr. Robert Ballard found Titanic after 73 years? Yes. I was about 12 years old at the time. If that didn't get you excited about science and oceanography and archaeology and history, I don't know what would. It had been a long, cherished dream to find this ship. We knew that she sank somewhere out there in the North Atlantic, but the problem was she went down 2.5 miles to the bottom of the ocean floor. 2.5 miles, 12,000 some feet is a long, long ways. And frankly, we didn't have the technology for decades to even attempt to go to those depths. So that's a big reason why it took so long. Now, when Ballard was down there with a French exploration crew, it was kind of a tag team effort to do this. He was actually on an assignment from the U.S. Navy, but it was top secret for years and years. A lot of this was classified, and it's only in recent years that it had been declassified. He was down there hunting Cold War era nuclear submarines that had sunk under mysterious circumstances in the 60s, the Scorpion and the Thresher. The Navy wanted to know A, exactly where they are, and B, are they giving off nuclear radiation? So Ballard had this contract. He had a certain amount of days to find those subs and then find out were they leaking radiation or not. And the Navy knew that he had gotten bit by the Titanic bug and wanted to find this ship. They said, if you get your work done for us and there's any time left on the contract, have at it. I'll go try and find Titanic for however many days you've got left on the contract. So it was important, what he learned is that there are actually ocean currents. We tend to think of the deep ocean as very dark, calm, and still. It's not. It is dark, no doubt about that. But there are ocean currents, powerful currents that are moving down there all the time. And when a vessel sinks, and a lot of them will tend to break apart, the contents of the vessel will spill out, and then they get pushed around by those ocean currents. And so he learned how to read these debris trails, and that's part of what led him to finding Titanic. So he only had 12 days left on that contract after finding the subs. He did find the subs. No, they weren't leaking nuclear radiation. 12 days left to find Titanic, and he found her in about 3 or 4 days. So, and this set the world on fire. But Titanic had really never, ever gone away from the public consciousness. When she took her maiden voyage in April of 1912, she was a cause célèbre. All the press was talking about this amazing ship. And she really was cutting edge. There was nothing like her on the planet. When you look at that old sketch of a sailing ship, that would have been the mode of transportation by sea for eons. And it wasn't that far removed from the days of the Titanic in 1912. Now, by the mid-1800s, this is when we start getting a little bit more modern ship power. And by the early 1900s, we have definitely moved away from actually needing wind to push us with our sails. They had big coal-fired engines, boilers on these ships. But this made a huge difference.
I found this on the web.
It's Alexa adding to the program, right?
She said you did a good job.
Oh, thanks, Alexa. And so, how many of you had ancestors that would have emigrated to America back in the day from Europe or elsewhere? Probably came on a ship. Yeah, quite a few of us, right? My heritage is Irish and German, so I find it fascinating that in case you ever wonder how long that ocean journey took, it depends. It could take 4 weeks, it might take 6 weeks. It just depends on what Mother Nature does to you, if there are any bad storms or anything like that. So for most of human history, if you took off, especially on a big journey like this in a sailing ship, you had no idea if you'd actually make it, for one thing. You had no idea if, like the people back home or the people waiting for you, if you're delayed, you have no way to communicate with them, nor they with you. And it was just really kind of up to Mother Nature. Now, all this changes with modern technology that we have by the early 1900s. With the class of ships that Titanic was, it was a long cherished dream. We can guarantee we'll get you across that North Atlantic passage in a week. And by the same token, the ships can go back in a week, pick up more passengers, or take people from here over to there. It becomes very profitable is what I'm saying, because suddenly we have reliability and speed. And the Titanic was part of that. Now, they decided to make Titanic not the fastest ship on the ocean, but they certainly made her the last word in luxury. She also had all the modern safety conveniences, and she also had this thing which was revolutionary, Marconi wireless. I've had little kids ask me sometimes, what's Marconi? Marconi is essentially the forerunner of radio. So for the first time in human history, if you had a Marconi set, you were within range of other ships or the shore, wherever there might be receiving towers, you could communicate with people even when you were out at sea. So we've got this ship that has the latest and greatest technology, including Marconi. She was dubbed practically unsinkable by Shipbuilder magazine. Everyone was excited for this maiden voyage in April of 1912. What could possibly go wrong?
We need another sheet.
So just to run a few numbers here, when she took off from Southampton, England, which is just right south of London, she was carrying roughly 2,200 passengers. She had a capacity for about 3,500. Plenty of life jackets. They called them life belts in those days. A little over 3,500 life belts. 20 lifeboats with a capacity of 1,178. Do you see a problem? It's so easy to be an armchair quarterback looking back with the luxury of time, isn't it? Oddly enough, this was actually legal, and it was actually exceeding the current safety regulations for ships of the era. Because what had happened, and we still face these challenges today, technology had moved so quickly. The safety rules for ships were still back in that 1890s era. And there hadn't been any major sea disasters of note from that time period, from roughly the late 1880s till 1912. So the regulations are outdated. This ship is talked up and bragged up as incredibly safe. What do we have to worry about? Titanic was the largest man-made moving object of its time. I was telling a lady up front here, by today's cruise ship standards, Titanic would be about yay big, and a modern cruise ship would be about yay big. But in 1912, she was the biggest man-made moving object on the planet. She took up about 4 city blocks. She was over 882 feet long. When I go to really little towns, I say she was basically longer than your whole town. About the width of a 4-lane highway and about 11 stories high. And that will come into play when the sinking happens. You've probably heard stories that a lot of people, at least at first, refused to get in the lifeboats. Well, with something that tall, and you're on the practically unsinkable ship, that's why people didn't want to leave. They couldn't believe she was actually sinking. Now, we had first, second, and third class on this ship. She was a British ship, so the British class system of the era is still very much alive and well here. Third class would have been more of your immigrant trade, or possibly second class folks that just wanted to save money and were traveling third class. So the equivalent in today's dollars would be roughly $300 to $800 for a third class ticket, which, you think about it, if you are a poor immigrant, that could be your life savings right here. Second class is more of your business traveler class, so roughly $1,200 a ticket there. First class all over the board. If you wanted to be cheap, $3,000. If you wanted to blow everything and have fun that week, over $80,000 for 1 week's trip. But the wealth in these days was just phenomenal. For one thing, we didn't have a federal income tax in America before till 1913. This is 1912. So if you got to hang on to a lot more of your money, you got rich faster. And then also, unlike today, if you are uber wealthy, you have your own private jets, you have your own private yachts, you don't travel with average Joe like you and me. So we will never see a time like this again, where we had all these levels of society on this one ship. Now, sometimes people ask me, so the James Cameron movie from 1997, would it have been possible that Jack and Rose would have gotten together? Absolutely not. That's total Hollywood. They would have been in completely different sections of the ship. They would not have mingled. It just wouldn't have happened, but it does make a good story, right? Yeah. Now, she was at sea for about 4 days before the tragedy happened. She had picked up her first round of passengers in Southampton, England on April 10th. She goes across the English Channel to Cherbourg, France. That's where a lot of the multimillionaires boarded the ship. And there are passengers coming and going. Some people would ride, they rode just from England to France and got off. Others came from France to Ireland and got off. But most of these folks were going to make the passage to New York. So after she picks up the passengers in France, she goes to a place called Queenstown, Ireland. Today we call it Cove, Ireland. She gets the last of the passengers, the last of the people just moving around Europe, get off at this stage, and then we're all set then. With about 2,200 passengers, we take off, bound for New York. It was literally smooth sailing for those first 3 or 4 days. You couldn't have asked for better weather. Everything was great. They did know that by the day of the sinking, which was a Sunday, April 14th, they knew that they were headed into a pretty heavy ice field with lots of icebergs. They'd been warned multiple times, but it was not unusual for ships to go relatively fast through those lanes, because remember, I had mentioned there had not been any major accidents at sea in this part of the world for 30-some years. So even though it sounds crazy by our standards, because we know how the story ends, what are you doing going at full speed through this known ice field? It was a common practice at that time. So the impact happens about 11:40 p.m. on a Sunday night. So most people had gone to bed, or they were headed to bed. There were a few people still partying in some of the saloons and whatnot, but it was quiet. It was just calm as could be. It was a real bright, starry night. And then all of a sudden, if you, like in the movie where the lookouts finally spot that iceberg, iceberg right ahead. There was only 37 seconds from the time of spotting the iceberg until impact. 37 seconds. And I mentioned that ship is 4 blocks long. Now, what they did, the man at the helm tried to turn it to miss the iceberg. Well, you can't do much in 37 seconds. It turns out that was the worst thing he could have done, even though all of us probably would have done the same thing. So what happened when he tried to turn the ship, it wasn't enough, and instead of hitting the berg straight on, the Titanic scrapes and scrapes and scrapes along this iceberg for about 6 seconds. It makes a whole bunch of little gouges and holes for quite some distance. Unfortunately, it just was too big of a distance, and had the gouges and little holes been just a little bit smaller, she probably would have stayed afloat. But it wasn't. That's not how it happened. And people that know a lot more about marine engineering and shipbuilding than I do say that had she crashed head on into that iceberg, no doubt there would have been a lot of damage, no doubt there would have been significant loss of life, but she probably would have stayed afloat. So easy to say all this in 2020 hindsight, right? It did take her about 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink. Now some people say that, well, that shows she really wasn't that well built. I argue to the contrary. If you've ever heard of the Lusitania, which was also another liner from this time period, she sunk in 1915, and she went down in about 20 minutes. You can't save too many people in 20 minutes. So this length of time did allow a significant number, not enough, but 700 some people to get off the ship. Now, this is just the dawn of the era of mass media, a little bit of fake news going on here too. This is from the Des Moines Evening Tribune. This is the evening edition, Monday, April 15th, 1912. So news got back to Iowa by the next night or the next day that something bad had happened to Titanic. Monster liner's passengers are all rescued. Wireless messages once more effective in the saving of lives. Though badly damaged, the great steamer is still afloat and making her way towards Halifax, Canada under her own steam. Okay, so I'm trained as a journalist. I'm mainly an ag journalist with my day job, but I am trained as a journalist, and this stuff drives me nuts. And it's crazy to think even in 1912 there was this rush to be first rather than right. So here people back home were thinking, okay, everything's fine. Well, everything wasn't fine. Now, for years and years, most of the Titanic stories were told through the lens of the rich and famous on board. I say these would have been the folks on People magazine covers and on TMZ had they been alive today. But they are interesting, and I only mention them in passing just so you get a sense of just what kind of wealth and privilege was on this ship in first class. John Jacob Astor IV, arguably the richest man in America, possibly one of the richest in the whole world. A New Yorker. Interesting there. Notice he was 47, his wife was 18. Yes, it was a second marriage. Divorce was incredibly scandalous in 1912. So he had been divorced. He remarried Madeline. When he remarried, he married this teenager. And they were tired of all the gossips in New York yapping about this scandalous second marriage. So he whisked her away on an extended honeymoon to Europe and the Middle East. They were coming back to New York on Titanic. She was pregnant by this time, and everything should have been happy and wonderful, and sadly, John did not survive the sinking. She did. She made it back to New York and gave birth to a baby boy in August of 1912. Anybody ever heard of the Guggenheim Art Museum? Yes? So there's Ben Guggenheim. He is part of that elite New York family attached to that art museum. They made their fortune with mining and such things. He was really kind of more of a playboy. He wasn't real serious about too many things. He liked money and he liked having a good time. So he was traveling first class on Titanic with his French mistress. He did not survive the sinking, the French mistress did. And then if you've ever heard of Macy's department store, I'm sure we all are familiar with that name. This is Isidore and Ida Strauss. They were co-owners of Macy's in 1912. So those of you who have seen the 97 movie, remember the older couple that holds hands and says we're gonna go down together? That is based on Isidore and Ida Strauss. And her reasoning was she could have gotten away, definitely in a lifeboat, but she said, I've been with you, Isidore, my whole life. Where you go, I go. And they literally went down with the ship. Now, Iowa has some amazing ties to Titanic. There's about 20 some stories, so we'll just hit on some tonight. I say that when I get the book done, we can come back and do Titanic too. We'll tell a whole new round of stories. But you can see here, we had everything, first, second, and third class. We had a cast of characters, and we'll get to some of that. But first, do you know what shocking Iowa event finally pushed Titanic out of the news headlines by June of 1912? Oh, 1912, there's a lot of stuff going on. Yeah, right? So let's talk about kidnappers. They're interesting, sadly. Michel Navratil Sr., he's the gentleman over there on the right. There's an Iowa connection here through him. Now, we got a little bit about his backstory. He was married to this lovely lady named Marcel. They were French. They had 2 young boys, aged 3 and 5. But sadly, this couple was having marital problems. And this was around Easter of 1912 when they had some sort of custody battle going on. And Marcel had the boys for the weekend. He was supposed to bring them back to their mother. He didn't. She had no idea what happened to her kids. She had no idea where Michelle was. Lo and behold, he had booked tickets on Titanic. And he passed himself off as a poor old widower that was taking his 2 young sons to America to start a new life. So he took an assumed name. He called himself Louis Hoffman. He gave the boys some rather interesting nicknames, Lolo and Moman. And everybody on board that was interacting with this guy just took him at his word. Oh, I'm so sorry you lost your wife. I'm so glad you're going to start over in America with your kids. And being a dad that probably was getting a little frustrated at times with some rambunctious young boys, one night at dinner he starts looking around thinking, I'd sure like a babysitter so I could go to the lounge and hang out with the guys. But remember, they're French, so they need someone who can speak French. Well, lo and behold, at this particular dinner, there was this new gal sitting at the table at the second-class dining saloon. He hadn't seen her before. It's because she'd been seasick most of the first part of the journey, even though it really was smooth sailing. She wasn't well, but her name was Bertha Lehman. She was 17. She was from Switzerland. This is our Iowa connection, because she was bound for Iowa. So they strike up a conversation, Michelle and Bertha, and he asked her if she would babysit the kids. She agrees. And then the night of the sinking, when everything is crazy, that's when everything starts changing. But first, a little bit more about Bertha. So she actually was jumping the gun a little bit. She was headed towards the Cedar Rapids area to a little town called Central City. She was supposed to come in May, but she had the chance to come early, and she thought, I'm not going to tell my family in Iowa. Won't they be surprised when I show up in April? Well, won't they be surprised with the stories she had to tell, because she actually did survive the sinking. But quite the interesting interconnection here with these abducted children. She too did not know they had been abducted. So there they are. There's the little boys. Aren't they cute? So this is after they had survived the sinking, and this is when they were in New York City after the rescue ship Carpathia had gotten them and the other survivors to New York safely. Everyone assumed they were bona fide orphans because there's nobody claiming these kids. The kids are really young, they speak French, so you can't really communicate with them too easily. And an Associated Press photographer took that picture. It goes viral. This is like the 1912 version of going viral. It gets in newspapers all over the world, and guess who sees it?
Wow.
Their mother. I cannot imagine what went through Marcel's mind when she sees this. Because remember, she's had a period of days, she has no idea where her kids or her husband are. So the husband, Michelle, he does not survive the sinking. The boys do. She gets on the first ship she can to New York, retrieves the kids, takes them back home to France. And they did well, they were fine. And actually the youngest one, he became one of the longest lived male survivors of Titanic.
Oh, it's a baby.
Yes. So Bertha, she too, she survived, like I mentioned. She made it to Central City. She married a guy named John Zimmerman, actually quite, well, that date is actually wrong. I need to correct that. But she married him within a year, so it was 1913 when she married this guy. I wonder sometimes with a quick marriage like that, now granted, people didn't mess around in those days. They got married young, but I do kind of wonder about this one. Perhaps it was a case where maybe there was a little PTSD going on, untreated trauma. Sometimes we make life decisions that maybe are a little bit hasty. It was a rough marriage. They did have a son named Elmer. John ends up getting sent to the battlefields of Europe during World War I. He gets badly injured. He does not survive his injuries. So suddenly she's a young widow, but she did remarry a guy named Carl Lewis, and life was good. They had more children. They lived on farms in the Dakotas, and all was well. And she did go back to Europe a few times to visit some family back there. There I am, Frances Marie Lefebvre. Remember I talked about that boring past. I know, kidnappers, polygamists, my goodness. So there's that Iowa City boarding pass, and as I looked at it that day, I thought, okay, I'm 40 years old, Frances Lefebvre. I'm from France, traveling third class. I've got 4 young kids with me. Where am I going? Mystic, Iowa. Anybody know where Mystic, Iowa is?
I grew up there.
You know all about it then.
Huh?
Yeah, you know all about it. Down by, it's Napanus County, down by.
Just a little bit north Centerville.
North of Centerville. Very much coal mining country down there back in the day when everything ran on coal. And that's why there were so many people headed to places like Mystic, Iowa. There were jobs there. And so Frances Marie had a husband who had come over to Iowa previously, a husband and an older son, and they were working in the coal mines. And my guess is that they'd gotten enough money put together to send for the rest of the family. So this was supposed to be a happy reunion. Well, sadly, none of these she and her children did not survive the sinking. And her husband, Frank, he'd been kind of a dirty dog while she was back in France. He, first of all, he did something stupid. He thought, well, you know, I haven't seen my kids for a while, and actually those little orphan boys that I just showed you, the orphans who weren't orphans, well, they could be my kids, so I think I'll sue the White Star Line. So that's the parent company of Titanic, the White Star Line. I think I'll sue for damages. Actually, all it did is get him in a world of trouble, because then he started making a ruckus. He makes a name for himself. The feds get onto him and find out he's basically an illegal immigrant. And he had also, on top of that, he had taken a common law wife while he was over here. So I don't know what would have happened had Frances actually survived this journey, because there's this other woman in the picture too. And she was mad as a wet hen because Frank had dumped her not all that long ago, and she only had pennies to her name, so she was mad at him. He's got the feds after him. She apparently too was not here legally, so last I could tell with the July 1912 edition of the Centerville newspaper, they both got deported back to France. So I don't know what happened to them after that. But you know, talking about suing for damages, actually that was really common with a lot of the survivors. And it's just like today, I really can't blame some of these folks. You lost everything. You barely escaped with your life. And this is an accident that never should have happened, frankly. And so you lawyer up. First we mourn for the dead, right? Then we lawyer up and we sue. So some, you know, history, we just kind of repeat some of the same old stories a lot. So yeah, oh, by the way, everybody had assumed names back then. He was Henry Dumontier. Wow, crazy. So yeah, that's when yeah, crazy. Now, some people acted much more well-behaved on this ship, including the Caldwell family. So that picture, even though it's grainy and it's hard to see, what we've got going on here is a gentleman named Albert Caldwell, his wife Sylvia, and their young son, dad was holding the baby there. You could say, well, why are you showing me such a crummy picture? That's a very significant picture because it was actually taken on the deck of Titanic. Now remember I told you that passengers were getting on and off as the ship picked up passengers around Europe before they headed to New York? Well, the Caldwells had a buddy who was a camera buff, and having pictures taken was kind of a big deal in 1912. Now we've all got camera phones, we take pictures like crazy. That was not the case back then. They were fortunate that they had a buddy that was into photography. They're fortunate that the buddy got off the ship and didn't travel to New York, because had he stayed on board, that camera and the film would be at the bottom of the North Atlantic. So that's actually a very priceless picture. The Iowa connection was with the father, Albert. He was the son of a Presbyterian minister. He was born way up in northwest Iowa in a little town called Sanborn in 1885. The family later moved to Allerton, so not terribly far from here, south central Iowa, not that far from Mystic, actually. And by the time young Albert is finishing high school and looking towards the next steps in life, he gets to go to college. Now, at this time, that's actually quite rare for boys to get to go to college. A lot of Iowa families would have said, hey, at 8th grade, you're done with your education, it's time to go to work. He got to go to college, and even more rare is that he met his future wife there. So if you thought it was rare for boys to go to college at this time, it was even more rare for women to have that opportunity. But he went to Park College. It is still there. It's still a functioning university. It's on the northwest edge of Kansas City, Missouri. And so Albert meets his wife Sylvia at college. They get married. And guess what? They both have jobs when they graduate because they agreed to be Christian missionaries for Park College. So they were sent to Siam, which today we call Thailand. But what a great adventure for a young newlywed couple, right? They got the world by the tail. They get to go see the world. They're teaching English. Life is great. They're making friends with other teachers over there. They have their first child, a little boy named Alden, while they are there. But then that's when the trouble starts, because Sylvia was never quite right after giving birth to that boy. We don't know if it was what we would call fibromyalgia or what her condition was, but she was very ill and she wasn't getting better. And it's such a hot tropical climate there, that doesn't help when you're not well. And they decided, I don't care what Park College says, we've got to break this contract and go home. And so that's what they did. And even today, if you travel to Thailand, that would be a major, multi-phase trip. It was incredibly difficult in 1912, and so they had to take a series of little ships and trying to work their way back. They get to Italy, and they thought, we're gonna get a little R&R. So they stopped in Naples, Italy. Well, that was a big mistake because there was a big cholera outbreak in Naples. So you can imagine, with an infant and a sick mother, cholera is about the last thing that you need to risk. This is where they hear about Titanic. And Albert, the father, thinks, wow, if we could get on that ship, that would be amazing. This is, literally smooth sailing, because this is the most luxurious, comfortable ship in the world. We've got to get a ticket for this ship. Now, I've been in touch with Albert's great niece, Julie Hedgepath Williams. She's a very lovely person. And she talks about how her great uncle Albert, when he went to the ticket office, he wanted, whatever type of second-class ticket he wanted was actually sold out. Even though Titanic herself was not sold out, the kind of ticket he wanted was gone. But they said, hey, come back tomorrow. You never know, someone might turn in a ticket. And so he did, and there were tickets available the next day, so they are pumped that they're going to have this wonderful experience. Their whole journey, their whole life story actually is documented in a really fascinating book that Julie wrote called A Rare Titanic Family. So I do recommend that you check that out if you want to know more about their life story. They are called a rare Titanic family because they all survived. Hardly any families on Titanic were intact after this disaster. And that actually caused a lot of problems for Albert, which we'll talk about. But they did make it back to the Midwest. Albert and Sylvia, they came back to Iowa, and he was a principal at Ames High for about 3 years, from 1914 to 17. Now, sadly, the marriage did not last. Once again, you wonder if there's some unprocessed trauma from what they went through. I don't know, but they did divorce. But don't worry, Sylvia did well. She remarried the president of State Farm Insurance Company. Cha-ching! Albert also remarried to a very lovely lady. Now, for years and years afterwards, you can imagine every time there's an anniversary, like the 10-year anniversary, the 25-year anniversary of the sinking, the press comes out in full force and they want to talk to survivors. Albert and Sylvia were always quite amenable to doing those interviews. It was actually their son Alden that despised that. He said, look, I've lived a full life, I've done all kinds of amazing things. All you want to do is ask me about that stupid ship that sank in 1912 when I was a baby. I don't even remember any of it. Leave me alone. And then for Albert, it was a little tricky too, even though he was willing to tell the story. At least early on after the sinking, he had to deal with a lot of flack. Because when people found out that he was a survivor of Titanic, well, what about women and children first? What did you do? Did you push women and children out of the way so that you could get in the lifeboat? And so you have to explain, no, I had a very sick wife and a baby that she was so sick she couldn't even hold the baby. I had no choice but to get in the lifeboat. So that was their story. Now, have anybody, I'm sure you're a very savvy audience. I'm sure that you have heard of the orphan trains. Yes. We did have a connection here too. I wish there were a lot more details about this nice lady, but sadly there are not. But we talked about those two little orphan kids that really weren't orphans. Well, there were some bona fide orphans after the Titanic tragedy. One of them was a gal named Helen Delaney. I wish I could find more information about her early years, but it's just very sketchy or non-existent. We do know that when she was about 4 years old, she was traveling on Titanic. She gets chucked into a lifeboat kind of at the last minute. Someone catches her, she survives this. Her parents, who apparently were traveling with her, did not survive. So she gets put in an orphanage in New York City. And this is if you know orphan trains, you know that orphanages at this time in New York and Boston and major East Coast cities were just flooded with kids. It was a never-ending onslaught of orphan kids that needed help. And so a Methodist minister named Charles Loring Brace, starting about the 1850s, had the idea, look, New York is a gritty, tough place. These kids don't have much of a future here. Let's try putting them on trains, sending them to places like Winterset, Iowa. They went to little towns in the Midwest, rarely to Des Moines and Cedar Rapids, the little towns. They wanted small town and farm families to take these kids in and give them a shot at a good life. And amazingly, it worked in a lot of cases, not all cases, but it was more successful than you'd think. Helen Delaney ends up on one of these orphan trains that goes to Council Bluffs, and she gets adopted by the James Delaney family. And she ends up spending the rest of her life in Council Bluffs. She graduated from high school there. She had various jobs there, including working at Kresge's, if any of you remember Kresge's. Yes, the forerunner of Kmart and such things. She was someone who never talked about her Titanic background. Most of her friends never knew that she had this tie. She let it slip late in life to her doctor one time that she had been a survivor of Titanic. And so there's very little written about this. You will find just a little bit in the Council Bluffs Non-Corral now and then. But she lived to age 74, died in 1982, and is buried in Council Bluffs. So there's that book I mentioned at that Iowa City Tea Party, Not My Time to Die. So this is where Dagmar Ryle's story comes in. She was traveling second class. She's a young woman. She's traveling with her fiance and her brother. They were headed to the Chicago area to visit relatives in Rockford, Illinois, with an ultimate destination of Red Oak, Iowa. The plan was to start a new life. And you just think, oh, how exciting that must have been. They didn't know how this story was going to end, but they must have thought, oh, life doesn't get any better than this. Now, in those letters that Lily Setterdahl translated out of the original Swedish from people like Dagmar, I feel like it's important to read those to you word for word, simply because she was there, I was not, and it helps fill in some gaps. And so she'd been traveling with her fiance, a young man named Ingvar, and her brother Kurt. And she's writing to an uncle in Rockford, Illinois. This is when she's in the hospital recuperating in New York City. Dear Uncle, Titanic has gone down. I don't know whether my fiance and brother Kurt are saved. Evidently they are not, for most of the men went under. I'm at a hospital and I'm not sick, although very feeble. I've lost everything. Now that's a simple statement to make, but it's so profound. Now you think about so many of these people who survived, they literally got away with the clothes on their back. They maybe or maybe not had money in their pockets. It could be in the purser's safe that went to the bottom of the ocean. The wealthy people for sure had trunk after trunk of treasures and fancy clothes and things that went to the bottom of the ocean. So not only is she traumatized, she's basically broke, has no support network with her anymore. I have no clothes and so cannot get up, so must lie in bed for present. I would have been glad if I'd been permitted to die. because life no longer has any value for me since I lost my beloved. I feel myself so dreadfully alone in this land. These people are certainly good, but nevertheless do not understand me. So I think there's a couple things going on here. When she says they don't understand me, the obvious answer is there's a language barrier because she speaks Swedish, and she's in America where people are speaking English, but then also the trauma. I mean, how do you even begin to talk to, it's kind of like the reason military veterans don't talk about a lot of this. If you weren't there, it's hard for the rest of us to understand, and frankly, it's hard to talk about. So I'm sure she is just feeling just completely out of sorts. So she goes on in more detail about what it was like that night when the Titanic hit that iceberg. So she talks about being in her berth. She was in her cabin when the Titanic hit the berg. She was in bed getting ready to go to sleep, or was asleep, and she says, I noticed the jar. So she felt something. Now, depending on where you were at in the ship, you either knew immediately something was horribly wrong if you were way down in the third class levels, especially up by where the mail room was, because that's where the berg hit, and suddenly water is pouring in. Second class, just like she describes, you probably saw if you had a water glass on your nightstand, you probably saw the water jiggle. You probably felt something like she talks about. A lot of the survivors talk about, I knew something was really off when the engine stopped and it got quiet. So that was distressing. And obviously her fiance, now men and women would have been in different parts of second class here. So his cabin would have been down the hall somewhere. He starts banging on her door. Get up, Dagmar, the ship has hit something. So she gets dressed quickly. Now even that minor detail is a really big detail because it's really cold out there. This is the middle of April. It's the middle of the night. Think how cold it can be in Iowa in the middle of April, in the middle of the night. But some people thought, oh, we're on the unsinkable Titanic. There's no need to get dressed and panic. So some people were going up on deck with just their pajamas on. Bad move when it's that cold. So they run up to the highest deck they could. They encounter some type of an officer or crew member who says, go back, there's no danger, go to your cabins. Now, we could really throw this officer under the bus and say, how could you say that to these people? He may not have known how bad it was, because frankly, it took a while even for the ship's officers to figure out just how bad this damage was. Where was it? How bad was it? And is it going to sink the ship? So it took time to ascertain that. And then also, once you realize, oh my gosh, this ship is not going to make it through the night, you don't go broadcast that to passengers, because then you've got panic and mutiny. And I'd like to say we don't do stuff like that anymore. That only happened in 1912. But I gave this program down in Corning last summer, and a lady came up to me afterwards. She said, oh my gosh, this was like deja vu. I was on a cruise ship about a year ago, and there was some type of fire, and it was bad. And they didn't really tell us what was going on, even though we kept asking anybody, what's going on? Oh, everything's fine, everything's fine. So all I can tell you from studying these disasters is if your gut is telling you that everything's not fine and it's telling you to run when people in authority are saying stay, trust your gut. So they go back to their cabins, and she tries to go to bed again, but suddenly there's more knocking on the door. Get up, Dagmar, we are in danger, Ingvar yelled. I don't care what the ship's officers say, this boat is sinking. Now she doesn't say what time all this is happening, but I have a clue here when she talks about the awful yelling and screaming. This tells me we're probably real close to 2 a.m. at that point, give or take, somewhere around there. This is when the bow has taken on enough water that your decks are tilting in ways decks should not be tilting. When that tilt keeps happening more and more, it will get to the point you won't even be able to stand up on the deck because the angle will be too steep. And I'm sure at this point too, you're looking around doing head counts and saying, there's a lot of people here and a lot of the lifeboats are left and we're not all getting in a lifeboat. And so this screaming and carrying on, And even at that point, when she is getting in the lifeboat, she doesn't want to let go of her fiance. She's kind of throwing a fit, saying, if he doesn't go, I'm not going to go. Come with me, Dagmar screamed as loud as she could, still holding Ingvar's hands tight. But then an officer ran forward and clubbed back Ingvar. The officer tore our hands apart and the lifeboat was let down. As it went down, I looked up. There, leaning over the rail, stood Kurt and Ingvar side by side. I screamed to them again, but it was no use. They waved their hands and smiled. That was the last glimpse I had of them. Now, that also, it sounds easier than it was. So you think, oh, okay, she's in a lifeboat. You just lower it to the sea and get away. Oh, no. It was a herky-jerky process with a lot of these lifeboats. Remember, this is this ship's maiden voyage. This crew has never worked together before. They're not even sure how to do some of this stuff because they've only been on this ship for about 4 days. It's all new to everybody. And sometimes, just in the panic of the moment, these lifeboats are not going down in a real orderly fashion. Sometimes a rope gets cut too soon, the bow of that lifeboat tilts, the boat's coming down too fast. There's accounts of survivors saying, I was in a lifeboat that was being lowered to the ocean, and I looked up and I could practically touch the bottom of the next lifeboat because it was coming too fast. So it just had to be absolutely panic at this point. And then when they talk about rowing away, that's another complication because not everybody in these lifeboats was a skilled oarsman. And not everybody had trained crew people in their boat. So sometimes fancy pants first class ladies were having to grab the oars and do the best they could to actually row that boat away. Some of those survivors talk about how raw their hands were after that night because of things like that. And they're panicking for a real obvious reason. That ship is huge. When it takes its final plunge, what kind of suction is it going to generate? Will my little tiny lifeboat be out of the danger zone, or am I going to just get sucked down and die that way? So actually that did not happen to anybody. There was no suction that took down any lifeboats, but you didn't know it at the time. And a lot of survivors talk about these dreadful screams that she mentions. The water was filled with crying people. A lot of survivors said that's the thing that traumatized them the most, the screams, the helpless people freezing out there in the water. And sometimes people think, well, they drowned. That's how you died if you didn't get in a lifeboat. No, it was actually hypothermia. Yeah. That water, the ocean water, was 28 degrees.
Oh boy.
Now you say, wait a minute, Darcy, water freezes at 32. Not if it's salt water. It can go a little bit lower and stay liquid. So 28-degree water. Now, has anybody ever been to the Titanic Museum down in Branson, Missouri? Oh, a few of you, good. Did you put your hand in the water fountain? Right? They have a bubbling fountain of 28-degree water. And when I went, I thought, you know what, I'm a farm girl. I've done chores and blizzards and such things. I'm tough. I bet I can hold my hand under there easily a minute, maybe 5 minutes. I'm delusional because having my hand under there 10 seconds made me cry for mercy. It is like knives being plunged into your body. It is so painful, you can't believe it. And so the medical doctors that have studied this, they say most likely most of these people passed within 20 or 30 minutes at the very most, if you were in the water. So there's a lifeboat that's called an Engelhart collapsible. The 20 lifeboats, there were 16 wooden ones, 4 were these collapsible canvas Engelhart lifeboats. Those are actual survivors in the North Atlantic. This would have been taken from someone on board the rescue ship Carpathia that Monday morning. So Carpathia gets there about 4:30 or so in the morning. So this is the other thing. It's easy to say, well, the rescue ship came. Well, when you're out there in those lifeboats, you have no idea if the guys in the Marconi room got the message out in time. Did anybody hear the SOS? Is anybody coming? There's a great debate about a ship called the Californian that was very close to Titanic that night. She did not respond and didn't come to help. If you look into that, that's a hotly debated issue to this day. Carpathia did pick up the rescue SOS, and the thing is, they were 58 miles away. That's a long ways when you're trying to hustle and save people on a sinking ship. And they were a smaller ship, they were not built for speed, they were actually carrying a bunch of Americans over to the Middle East, to Gibraltar. There were a lot of vacationers on board that ship, including an Iowan who was one of the first to break the story in the newspaper, but we'll talk about that another day. But you think about what that captain had to do, the captain of the Carpathia. He had to speed in the middle of the night, and he had to go through the exact same ice field that just sank Titanic. That's a gutsy move, that's a moral dilemma that, I mean, you can argue, was it even sane for him to do that? Because he could have risked the lives of everybody on his ship. But he said later, I felt God was with me. I think he was. So poor Dagmar, she gets hauled up into Carpathia that morning, and she is just hysterical, like so many of the other survivors. She just can't quit crying. She said, I never would have allowed those men to put me in this boat if I knew that my brother, my fiance, wouldn't have made it. And she did return as quickly as she could to Sweden, and she did marry a nice gentleman named Eric Holmberg. She died in 1969. Now, we talked about Red Oak. There's actually another Montgomery County connection. So if you're familiar with the little town of Stanton on Highway 34, that is where this family is from, the Danbaum family. So Ernest, he was a farmer. He was a young man who was a first-generation Swede. If you know that part of the world, there's a lot of Swedish heritage over there. So he was newly married, and he and his wife were going to take an extended honeymoon back to the old country, to a place called Kisa, Sweden, to visit family and friends. So he and his wife Anna took off on this honeymoon. And sometimes we think in those days people made these trips, like if you came from Europe to America and you never saw the old country again. Sometimes that was true, but it's amazing how much traveling was going back and forth, and his story kind of proves this. They were over there long enough that they gave birth to their first child, so obviously this was an extended trip. So that's little baby Gilbert there. And in April of 1912, they are preparing to come back to southwest Iowa. And think how excited Grandma and Grandpa must have been back at Stanton. They knew this grandchild had been born. They'd never gotten to meet the baby, so we're glad to have the parents and the baby coming back. And also, Ernest had a little side hustle here. Apparently he got paid, this was all on the up and up, but he got paid for every family member and friend that he could convince to travel on the White Star Line. He'd get a little kickback. So he had a group of about, I know I have 11 there. I've seen anywhere from 11 to 13 people were in this little group. The number's unclear, but we do know that they were a solid little group traveling to America. And that Anna Nyston, who's listed there, her story will be in the book. We're not going to talk about her tonight, but she was a longtime Des Moines resident. She obviously survived. So this is what they were all traveling third class. This is what your cabins would have looked like. Very Spartan by today's standards. Very luxurious by 1912 standards, as hard as that is to believe. And just the fact that you got meal service, even in third class, that was still kind of a novelty in 1912. Ladies, don't worry. If you are worried about bathroom facilities like bathtubs, there's one at the end of the hall for 700 women to share. And guys, you're covered too. There's one for 700 men down in your part of the ship. Sadly, out of that whole bunch, only Anna was the one that survived. And we do know that they were able to retrieve Mr. Danbaum's body. The family had enough resources, they were able to ship it back from Halifax, Canada to Stanton, Iowa. There's his tombstone. Whenever I go through Stanton, I try and swing by the old cemetery, pay my respects. And that's one of the few of our Iowa connections where they actually denote the Titanic connection on the tombstone. So it has his birth date, his death date. It mentions he died in the Titanic disaster, and his remains were recovered from the ocean. Now, this is an interesting thing to think about, because when you recover a body in 1912, how do you identify these bodies? There's no driver's licenses, there's no social security cards. You're kind of guessing. You guess based on how they're dressed. If a guy's wearing a tuxedo, he's probably not third class, so you start looking at the first class passenger list. This gentleman was third class, so they could probably figure out, okay, he's not first class, probably not second class by the way he's dressed. He had some money in his pockets. Sometimes folks would have some paperwork or something that were clues to who they were. But there were two cable laying ships that were tasked with recovering any bodies they could in the aftermath of the disaster. Now a cable laying ship, what they were was just, they were workhorses. They had big spools of cable on them for telegraph service. As early as the 1860s, we had underwater, on the bottom of the ocean, telegraph wires so that we could communicate between America and Europe. Isn't that fascinating that it goes back to the late 1800s? But that's what these crews normally would have been doing, is working on those cables. Well, guess what? The White Star Line hired them and said, you're gonna be morticians for about a week. We're gonna hire your ships. You're gonna go out there with a Catholic priest and a Protestant minister. We're gonna load you up with as many coffins as you can carry and formaldehyde, and you're gonna go out there and retrieve bodies. And so Ernest was one of the bodies that did get recovered and sent back home. And I think it's interesting, on his tombstone, it references the old hymn, Nearer My God to Thee.
So how did they identify him?
I think it was some paperwork in his pockets that kind of gave it away. And then also, I'm sure that the families would have had input too, like here's some things to look for. So, yeah, and not everybody, some of those bodies that they tried to recover, they were just so far decomposed, even after a few days, they had to do burials at sea. And they never did find Ernest's wife or his child. Those were just gone. Now, we did have a first-class family on board from Cedar Rapids, the Douglas family. Has anybody ever been to the Brucemore Mansion? Yes. Yes, so this is that family. It's actually relatives of Walter and Mahala Douglas. Walter had, so the family had made their fortune in grain milling. To this day, Cedar Rapids is still a grain milling town. If you drive through town, it smells like cereal some days, right? Yeah. So they made their business with fortune with Quaker Oats, and then Walter, who's the son of that first generation, he did well too. He made his money with corn milling. So if you grind corn into corn starch, that was his business, and he got very wealthy doing that. Wealthy enough that he could retire by age 50, which is not too shabby. And he was traveling on Titanic in 1912 with his second wife, Mahala. Now, Mahala was a local girl from Cedar Rapids. She had always been kind of the talk of the town. She was kind of a scandalous woman in some respects. One of her biggest faux pas that set the gossips' tongues wagging in Cedar Rapids was that she smoked. Very unacceptable for ladies in 1912. And also, once again, a second marriage here, so that's frowned upon in certain circles. So they decided, you know what, Cedar Rapids just is not where we want to be. They were building, or had built in 1910, a big luxurious home up in Minnesota, southwest of the Twin Cities on Lake Minnetonka. So if you know that area, this is where the kind of, like if you have megabucks, like if you're a Minnesota Vikings player or any professional athlete, that's the kind of place where you live, is out on Lake Minnetonka. So they lived in a neighborhood called Deep Haven. That's where they built their mansion. The house is still standing, by the way. And another reason you would want to live on a lake, especially at this time period, is because there's no air conditioning in 1912. And if you live on a lake, you get a little bit of natural air conditioning from the breezes. So they had a fabulous home. They had been on this great grand European excursion to buy all kinds of wonderful treasures for that new home. Artwork, furniture, you name it. They had been back in Cedar Rapids just the previous Christmas of 1911, celebrating with the Douglas family, but then they go on this big 3-month vacation to celebrate Walter's retirement. They are headed back to Deep Haven in Minnesota in time for his birthday. Life is great. They got to celebrate on board the ship. They were having dinners with the captain and other first-class passengers. Skip that one. Now I can't tell you exactly what their cabin looked like, but some first-class cabins looked like this, the high-end ones, and that is just the parlor. There would have been a bedroom and other rooms connected to it, so a little bit different than those bunk beds we saw. So what happened? That night, when the ship was going down, Mahala has the chance to get in a lifeboat. Naturally, she wants Walter to go with her. He refused. He said, no, I must be a gentleman. And by reports of people who saw him before the ship went down, he was last seen on deck helping other people in the lifeboats while he's still wearing his tuxedo from the party. Now, in those days, when we saw there had been fake news, even as early as Monday, April 15th, 1912, if you knew you had a loved one on board, you are panicking. Did they live? Did they die? Well, the fastest way to find out in those days, before you had text messaging and everything else, you would go to the local newspaper office because they have the telegraph service. And sadly, the Douglas family got word by telegraph that Walter had not survived. Mahala did survive. She ends up going back to Deep Haven. She spent the rest of her life there. She was quite a patron of the arts by all accounts. And at some point, she wrote this poem. And once again, I feel like you need to hear it her words because she was there, and this is just really heart-rending. The sea, velvet smooth, blue-black. The sky set thick with stars unbelievably brilliant. The horizon a clean-cut circle. The air motionless, cold as death. Boundless space. A small boat waiting in this vast stillness, waiting heartbreakingly. In the offing a vast ship, light streaming from her portholes. Her prow on an incline, darkness comes to her suddenly. The huge black hulk stands in silhouette against the starlit sky. Silently the prow sinks deeper, as if some titan's hand, inexorable as fate, were drawing that great ship down to her death. Slowly, with hardly a ripple of that velvet sea, she sinks out of sight. Then that vast emptiness was suddenly rent with a terrifying sound. It rose like a column of heavy smoke. It was so strong, so imploring, so insistent, one thought it would even reach the throne of grace on high. It suddenly lost its force, then to a tiny wisp of sound, then to a pitiful whisper, silence.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. And yet we can't quit talking about this ship that sank so long ago, and it's kind of crazy because a lot of time has passed. There's been a lot worse shipwrecks since this with much greater loss of life, and yet we keep talking about it. And I think it's simply because it's such a captivating human story. Now, you go back to 1912, it was all over the news. But then 1914, that's the outbreak of World War I in Europe. Tremendous loss of life in World War I. Then comes the Great Depression, tremendous hardship. Then comes World War II, more carnage and hardship. Nobody was talking much about some old 1912 shipwreck. But then, 1955, everything changes. A guy named Walter Lord, who had been a kid back in the 19-teens and 20s, he remembers those days of those transatlantic luxury liners. He rode a few when he was a kid. And he got to thinking, you know what? It's the early 50s. I bet some of those survivors from Titanic are still alive. I wonder if they talk to me. So he starts reaching out to people like the Caldwells. Hey, I'm doing a book. Would you let me interview you? And a number of them said yes. It led to a book called A Night to Remember, and it set the world on fire. People were fascinated all over again with Titanic. That leads to 1960, The Unsinkable Molly Brown, which was a tribute to Margaret Brown. They never called her Molly in her life, but it made a better sounding title from Hollywood and Broadway. So first comes the musical, then comes the film in 1964. And about every 10 years, it seems like there's something that reignites interest in this. Now I haven't updated that slide. I know it says 2018. This has been an on-again, off-again project. but there's a businessman from Australia that had the idea, let's make an exact replica of Titanic and call it Titanic 2. It's being built in China for what that's worth. But when it's done, I saw just last year, the project is allegedly on again. So if it gets done, how many of you want to buy a ticket? Now, if there were kids in here, I guarantee there'd be at least one or two kids saying, yeah, me.
If you can afford it.
Yeah, if you can afford it, right? So there's not, in terms of actually connecting with pieces of Titanic, there's not a ton because some of the artifacts have been brought up, but there are occasionally these traveling exhibits. There's one in Denver, Colorado right now that I'd like to go to. It sounds really cool. They've got virtual reality, 3D, all kinds of high tech to tell the story. I went to this one in 2018 out at the National Geographic Museum. That was a temporary exhibit, but it was fascinating. And as I study all this, I think that the reason we can't let this story go is we wonder, what would I have done if I were on that ship that night? Would I have behaved properly? Would I have been a jerk? Would I have survived? Would I have died? You just wonder. And I can't answer that for any of us, but I can tell you, we can run a few numbers of what we do know. So when the rescue ship Carpathia docked in New York on April 18th, 1912, there were roughly 713 survivors from Titanic. Ladies, you had a really good shot, about a 3 in 4 chance of making it, because 74% of the women survived. Kids, about 50-50, 52% survived. Men, not good, about a 1 in 5 chance of survival, 20% made it. If you were first class, your odds are good. A lot of them did survive, other than the men. Second class, more that 50-50 survival range. Third class, not good. About 75% of them perished, sadly. Now, how many of you remember seeing pictures or in the movie that beautiful grand staircase? How could you forget, right? So it also, when Cameron made that movie in '97, they didn't have all the cool computer technology we do today, so to make that sinking scene look realistic, they had to use so much water it actually destroyed the movie set, which is interesting. But I want you to notice that beautiful floor down there. If I had to guess whether you thought that was marble, tile, or linoleum, what do you think that was? Marble, tile, or linoleum?
Tile.
Marble? It was actually linoleum. Can you believe that? Linoleum wasn't new at that time. It had been invented in the late 1860s, but it's just like when you fly on an airplane. Weight counts, right? So tile and marble are heavy. And not only are they heavy, and linoleum is lightweight, but linoleum, you can make it any color, any pattern you want. So the designers loved it. So we think that, the high-end ship, yeah, it had linoleum, so that is absolutely true. So there's not all that much left of Titanic today. You can go to some of these exhibits, you will see deck chairs, plates, random things like that. But do go. There's a great debate about whether salvagers should have brought any of those artifacts up from Titanic. Because some people say that's a graveyard, you're desecrating a grave when you go down there and mess around. I disagree a little bit. I think it's worthy to go down there and retrieve a few of those things, because I have seen how people react when they go through these exhibits. And there are some really great museums, not a lot, but there's about 3 that I would recommend you definitely check out if you like this stuff. There's the one in Branson, Missouri. They have a sister Titanic museum in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, so Dollywood. And then also there, believe it or not, one is in Las Vegas. So at the Luxor Hotel, the one that's shaped like a pyramid, they have a fantastic Titanic exhibit in there. And I'll never forget walking out of that one in Vegas. So you had your boarding pass, and then at the very end you see the list of names, you find out if you lived or you died. And on that last wall, they said, tell their tales and share their stories. That's what you can do to keep that history alive. That's why it matters. And that's exactly what we've done here tonight. Tell their tales and share their stories. So It's been a pleasure being here with you. I've got all my books here tonight, other than the Titanic one, which is still a work in progress. I've got copies of Madison County. I've got one on Dallas County, one on my home county of Calhoun, classic restaurants of Des Moines and their recipes, yes. A culinary history of Iowa, so if you want to know more about why we eat what we eat, that's a fun one, has recipes too. If you're into farming at all, this is really written for non-farmers as well, but Iowa agriculture, lots of great stories in there. And then also one of my latest books, The Lincoln Highway in Iowa. So Highway 30, the forerunner of the interstate. This is like your little travel guide of all the fun stops along the way from Clinton to Council Bluffs. You're welcome to come up and take a look. I'm happy to sign copies. The books are $26, although these books, they're $24, and that includes your sales tax. But they make great Mother's Day gifts and Father's Day gifts. But come visit with me afterwards if you're so inclined, and I'm happy to take any questions, or if you have any comments after this program. Yes?
The ensemble that they showed playing on a deck.
Yes,
Was that
the
true
band.
as the ship went down?
Yes, that is absolutely true. What was the orchestra, that little orchestra ensemble playing? Absolutely. And part of why they did that, A, they were very brave men, but also it was to keep passengers calm right to the end. And not one of those musicians survived. There's a wonderful book about that called And the Band Played On. So if you want to know more about the band, I mean, it's one of those little very narrow slivers of history, but it's a really good book. And the Band Played On. Yes.
Did you say that there's a exhibit in Denver?
Yeah, right now there is. I believe it opened in April. And I want to go to it just because of all the high tech. It's cool with all the technology we have. They can do things with 3D, virtual reality, all this stuff to make you feel like you're actually walking through the ship and such things.
I love to tour historic homes. I have all my life, and when we were in Denver, we were going to a game with some friends, and I said, could we please visit Molly Brown's mansion?
Yes. Did you go?
We went, and it was closed for
Oh.
the day.
Oh.
But I did walk all the way around it.
And you saw the big lions out front. and
Yes, it's
everything.
beautiful.
It is. It's a cool house. My husband and I went out there a few years ago. Molly Brown is such an interesting person in her own right. I learned from that tour she was one of the first in not just Denver, but kind of the whole country to take animal rights seriously and help found an animal shelter and things like that. So here's a little trivia since we're Midwesterners. Her hometown is in Missouri. Does anybody know where she grew up? Hannibal, yes, Hannibal, Missouri, as in Mark Twain, Hannibal, Missouri. So that is Molly Brown's hometown.
That's a great place to visit too.
I love Hannibal, yes, lots of history there.
Yeah.
Yes, in the back.
One of my favorite stories about the Titanic is the one where a teacher assigned, a high school teacher assigned his class to see, given the time that they had, whether there would have been a way for them to survive, and those high schoolers came up with the answer. It was to take the doors off. They had so many doors, and the doors would have kept the people out of the water.
Oh, interesting, like if you use the door as a flotation device?
As flotation
Yeah.
devices.
Oh, how interesting. Yeah, that probably would have worked had you been able to do that. Because there is actually a guy who will be in my book. We didn't talk about him tonight, but he was from Burlington. He was a Swede named Gunnar Tenglin. And he was one of the last to get off that ship. He thought he was going to go down with the ship. And essentially, he floated off the ship when she makes her final dive. And he manages to scramble up on an overturned lifeboat and made it through the night until the Carpathia got there. So it was possible to do stuff like
But there
that.
were doors all over.
Oh yeah, as long as you would have had a tool to.
Yeah.
But they figured it out. They had time to do it, and they started taking those doors off
I'll be
immediately.
darned. Yeah.
But nobody thought of it.
Yeah, right? Because that's how it goes in a moment of panic. Sometimes we can't think clearly, can we? Yes, did you have another comment?
Could you anticipate when your Titanic book will be?
Well, I keep saying it's gonna be in a few months, and then I end up lying, so I really do wanna get it done by this fall, so it can be ready for Christmas, so. Yeah, I want this book done, yes. Thank you.
I want it for Christmas, Mandy.
There you go. Yes,
Oh, you said the Macomb Wireless?
Marconi,
Is there a connection to that and the award that WHO Radio?
absolutely, the
received?
Marconi Award, so his name was, I think, Guglielmo Marconi, he was an Italian, and he was the inventor of that Marconi Wireless, which was the forerunner of radio, so you're exactly right, that's the connection. Yes, yes.
I have a question, it's on the Titanic.
That's
but
all right.
Curiosity is, how do you choose your books? You've got some very interesting books.
Yeah, how do I choose? You know, it's really hard because sometimes I've got a list about yay long of ones I want, and my publisher wants certain ones. Yeah, sometimes it's just like pick one and go with it. And honestly, sometimes I also have to assess like the people that might still be alive that could, so I could do first person interviews. How old are they? That sounds a little crass, but you know, sometimes you've got to catch people before it's too late, you know what I mean? But yes, my publisher wants a book on Iowa's amazing women, so that'll probably be another one.
Griffin Smith, you have her.
Oh, yes.